Hi there, welcome everyone. This is Art Gongora with RCMAR CHIME. Wow, a lot of people. Thank you for joining us. We'll just 1 minute. I believe there's a few other people who are just getting off, so we might start a couple minutes late. Thank you. All right, everyone. We have Dr. Del Pino joining us finally. I think we're ready to get started. Dr. Hayes, would you mind?
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to do a quick intro of Homero.
Give me a quick second. I just got on from the previous meeting and I'm going to...
You want me to do a slow intro, Homero?
Slow and easy works.
Okay. So it's not going to be long, but just for people who do not know, Dr. Del Pino is Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior at Charles Drew. And his primary focus of research is the role that families play in a person's recovery process from substance abuse. And he likes to focus primarily on the recovery process of older gay Latinos. Now, today's talk, as I think everyone knows, is a really important issue that the faculty and the scientists have been struggling with for the last 6 months, given what's happened with the pandemic. So I'm sure there will be a lot of interest, a lot of discussion, and we're really appreciative to Homero for taking this on because it's so important to know about how you collect data in this difficult time, remotely or online, when it's not possible to be face-to-face with people. So, Homero, are you still working?
I am ready to share my screen.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Let's see. I'd say it's nice to see familiar faces, but very few people have their video on. So it's nice to see familiar names. Oh, hey, Heather, Dr. Norris. Hey, Jerry. Hello, everyone. So I prepared to share my screen here. Let's see. I go into slideshow. All right. I am ready to go. Well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to present on this. Again, this is strategies for remote online interaction with research COVID participants. This is actually one of my go-to slides for most of my presentations. What if I told you that reading a PowerPoint aloud isn't the same as teaching? I really detest PowerPoints overall. I prefer to have conversations with people. If I spend most of the time talking, you'll be bored. I'll bore myself as well. So I would really appreciate just kind of have a conversation with you and interaction. So I welcome all kinds of questions as the presentation unfolds. Feel free to try to jump in and ask questions. If it's something that I'm going to address, that I will address later, I'll just let you know. So before we begin, I do want to have some acknowledgements. A lot of what I'm going to present to you today is pretty much lessons learned from transitioning my research projects from face-to-face interviews to online formats. And I have a community partner, St. John's Clinic, with Victor Martinez and Edwin Rojas. And at Drew, Ms. Petra Duran, Aníbal Ángeles, and Sarah Hernandez are on the staff on that side of the team. So a lot of, again, what I'm going to present to you are what I've learned from my projects. And there's two projects in particular from which some of this presentation comes from. One of the projects is a center grant through Access at Drew, which is to develop sibling-based intervention to develop and promote PrEP messages for gay Latino men. That's the first project. The other project is my K Award, which is, again, similar aims to interview the family members of Latino gay men to see how we can engage them in HIV prevention. So these are the projects that are yielding the data for this presentation. All right, so hopefully by the end of this presentation, participants will be able to prepare for online interviews. I'm going to keep this presentation on practical do's and don'ts, if you will, rather than a theoretical framework of how to conduct online research. And I hope to present to you 3 advantages of collecting data online. I know I've heard people talking about collecting data online as being a big challenge. So I would like to kind of reframe that and think of it as what are some advantages to actually collecting data this way. So there'll be 3 parts to my talk. Part 1 will be preparing for the interview, everything you need to do beforehand. Part 2 will be the day of the interview, and then part 3 post-interview or when you're done with the interview. All right, so preparing for the interview. So I thought it would be a good idea to remind ourselves, why do we conduct qualitative research in the first place? So it is a challenge to do this interactive on Zoom, but can someone or a few people tell me why do we conduct qualitative research in the first place?
Because we don't want to assume we know things that we don't know.
Don't want to assume that we know what we don't know. Good.
Define.
Go ahead.
I'll go to answer the why.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, someone else was going to participate and stopped.
I was going to say, this is Michelle Keller, to gain a better understanding of, so potentially, you know, in mixed methods research, we might use it to like either kind of generate hypotheses for a quantitative study, or, you know, if we're doing it the other way around, we might use it to actually, as someone mentioned, like to explain like what we may have found in quantitative research. So really kind of exploring on like the how and the why.
All right, good. So, sorry, my screen turned off. All right, so what do I have here? All right. So what I have, we conduct qualitative research to get insight into people's experiences, to understand why they do what they do. To interpret some of our findings can also be a reason to conduct qualitative research, right? And also for guidance to understand what, you know, what should be the next steps, perhaps, right? Hypothesis generation, as Michelle mentioned, right? So if we keep this in mind, I feel like this is the prize, right? We have to keep our eyes on the prize and not get distracted by whether or not is my interview being conducted online or is this face-to-face, right? I feel like, again, I would just like to start off by saying, why are we conducting qualitative research in the first place? And then try to understand how does online data collection facilitate or interfere with these aims, right? How does online data collection interfere with generating hypotheses, for example, or making sure that we don't think we know what we don't know. So the first thing that happened in our project was IRB. I think that's the first thing that we need to think about when we start transitioning from a face-to-face project to an online project. The first thing we had to worry about was recruitment. All our recruitment material was saying that we were going to do face-to-face interviews. So we had to go back and redo our materials to include online. Literally, you have to get an amendment just to put that you're going to conduct interviews online as well. We couldn't just start conducting them online. And we had a back and forth with recruitment about Grindr. As I mentioned, our population is working with Latino gay men. So we thought that Grindr would be a good place to recruit men. So for those of you who may not be familiar, Grindr is a hookup app. So we thought this would be a good place to recruit Latino gay men. This is pre-COVID-19. Post-COVID-19, we had IRB ask us, how can you recruit people on Grindr when there is a public health crisis going on right now and no one should be, hooking up or, socializing at all. We need to be 6 feet apart, hard to have sex 6 feet apart. So, you shouldn't be going on Grindr, because they thought that we might be encouraging that kind of behavior. So we did an amendment to Grindr off. This is in March, early April. By late April, we have all these articles coming out about how people are feeling isolated because of the pandemic, and they're actually using apps like Grindr to connect socially with other people. So besides just hooking up, people are now just connecting socially. So all these hookup apps, while I know there were people who continue to hook up, were also becoming places for people to just connect socially. So it was back to the IRB to get an amendment to get Grindr back into our recruitment strategies. Advertising, I'll show you more of that in a minute. One of the biggest changes that we had to talk about in our IRB was consent. Our project was a very straightforward project. People will come in, sit down, review the consent form with them, ask them if they have any questions and have them sign it, we sign it, we keep a hard copy. But now that we started transitioning to doing interviews online, we can no longer do that. And I'll talk more about what we actually did in its place, but it's something that you want to keep in mind when you start transitioning from doing face-to-face interviews to doing interviews online. And the other thing that had to change in our IRB application was incentives. We were paying $50 to participants cash. Obviously, we cannot do that because of the pandemic. So we had to do a workaround that. We ended up using other apps, which I'll show you that in a minute as well. All right, so this is a flyer for our project. Again, as I mentioned, we were interviewing Latino gay men in a sibling that they trust. So we had flyers that targeted Latino gay men, and we had flyers that targeted the siblings. This is a flyer that targeted the siblings. And literally what we had to do with our IRB was go back and change this right here, where I have circled in red, to add online interview. I decided to keep it as a disjunct because I figured at some point this will end and we can still use a flyer. So I didn't want to commit us to having a flyer that only says online and then have to go back to the IRB and take the online off and put face-to-face. So I just left it like that, a little more ambiguous. So when you do develop promotional materials or recruitment materials in particular, it's something to think about. Hopefully this pandemic will be over soon, but we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So I think having recruitment materials that give you that flexibility for recruiting people either face-to-face or online will be very important. Okay, so some things to do before the interview. And I think here it's a good way to talk about this is to just do a very simple before and after. What did we do things face-to-face? What was that like before? And before COVID-19 and now after, what are these same procedures like now? So I mentioned a little bit earlier about consent forms. So consent forms were signed in person. Now, at least for our protocol, the consent forms are sent emailed ahead of time, and we do it in Zoom as well. So participants are recruited, they're screened, they're enrolled, and after they're enrolled, they're emailed consent forms. And they're supposed to email back, yes, I agree to be a part of the study. So we have one record of the consent form. And then when they come in for the interview, we also ask them if they consent to be a part of the study. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to the section on what to do during the interview. But this is one of the biggest differences before and after. So before, surveys had to be completed the day of the interview. People would come in, complete their surveys, the demographic information or whatever other validated instruments you're using, and then proceed on to the interview portion. Now we send the participants links. We're using REDCap. We send participants links ahead of time so they can complete their surveys online. After the surveys are completed, then they schedule an interview with us. So they're spending less time in the office filling out paperwork, if you will, now than before. And if there's any, I think the biggest thing, the biggest change that was the most significant and most helpful is the one I'm about to talk to you right now. Before, questions were asked during the interview. Now we're sending questions ahead of time to avoid the deer caught in headlight looks from participants. So we started sending the first three questions to participants ahead of time. Why? The first 2 or 3 times that we did our interviews online, they were very flat. Participants were kind of looking at me like, who are you? What do you want? I would ask them a question, they had to stop and think about it. Then someone suggested send them some of the questions ahead of time so they have time to think about it, they're familiar with it, and it doesn't just catch them off guard or put them on the spot to think about it. So for example, we're interviewing sibling pairs. So one of the questions that we asked them is, can you share a happy memory with us that you have of each other? Easy enough question. Another question we would ask is, can you talk about a time when you helped each other change a behavior? Again, fairly simple questions, something they can think about so that when they come to the interview, they're prepared and they don't feel caught off guard or put on the spot by the questions. Because remember, we know what we're going to ask them. They have no idea what they're going to be asked, right? So this is kind of helps break the ice a little bit. So I highly recommend this, actually, sending some of the questions ahead of time. We don't really lose anything by doing so. So the big change before was in-person interview. Since they're not in person, we have to do a test run. This is also very important. So our coordinator would contact participants and do a dry run with them on Zoom to make sure that they know how to connect, that they have enough bandwidth or sophisticated enough phone to connect to Zoom, to let them know where they need to be, like in a private room, for example, when they're being interviewed, how long the interview is going to last, and who's going to interview them. So all that conversation will take place over Zoom. And just give the participants a feel ahead of time of what to expect during or what's going to happen in the interview. So I feel like this is a big difference. Again, sending questions ahead of time and actually preparing participants. And before, we will give people incentives after the interview. That's kind of the same. We still give participants their incentives after the interview, but now we actually also have to give them instructions for Venmo or Cash App. So I mentioned that we would pay them cash if it was in person. And again, just to give you some more background of where our experience is coming from. The first 3, we are supposed to interview 40 sibling pairs. The first 3 sibling pairs that we interviewed were in March. The last one was March 13, right before the whole quarantine started. So they were paid in cash. Then we needed to come up with a new system to pay participants, once we interview them online. And it's very easy to say, well, get Venmo, get Cash App. But not everyone uses this and not everyone is familiar with this. So what the team did, we created a guide for how to use Venmo and how to use Cash App. Right? We want to prepare the participants to be able to get their incentive. So what you're looking at here are screenshots of how to sign up. We put arrows. You literally want to walk a person through the pictures, because even though you're putting up screenshots, remember, people see what they want to see. People will interpret things their way, and we don't want that. We want to tell people what to look at, what to interpret. Step one, this is the home screen. Step two, signing up to Facebook, etc. Basically what these boxes, these little dialog boxes on the side are doing are telling the participant how to think about the picture that they're looking at and what it is that they're being told in plain English. And again, you want to tell people how to move through the entire process. Again, we have it labeled out as step 3, step 4. And just to focus here a little bit, again, the instructions, Venmo will need to text your verification code, enter the code in the next screen, which again may seem very simple to people, to those of us who have used these apps multiple times and have multiple versions of payment apps. But for someone who doesn't, this is very crucial. And here what we see is when we send the instructions, we also highlighted what we want them to look at. So here we see what's highlighted, right? Settings, payment methods. This is especially for people who do have a bank account, what they can be looking at, what instructions to follow. And as we know, not everyone may have a bank account. So Venmo and other Cash Apps, what they do is they give you a debit card. So you create your account, we deposit the incentive money into your account, and then within a few days, 4 to 5 days, they will mail you a debit card. And now there is your money. So you don't need a bank account. So all this was by way of preparing participants, things that we could do ahead of time before we have the actual interview. Again, this is the card. So this is on the programmatic side. On the hardware side, if you will, some things that we can do before the interview. Update your router. This may seem very basic, but most of us use, I'll just use myself as an example. I was just using the router provided by my cable company, right? And I would conduct interviews and sometimes they were glitchy. Sometimes I would miss what people were saying. I think we've all have had enough experience with Zoom to know what that looks like or what that sounds like. And this is being recorded. And the straw that broke the camel's back was when I submitted my interviews to be transcribed and I got charged extra because the audio was difficult to follow. There were just parts where it was lagging. And so I decided to upgrade my router and I actually went out and bought a whole Wi-Fi mesh system. Now my whole house is routed. I feel like I stepped into the new century. So I highly recommend getting a router. If you're going to conduct a lot of interviews, online, focus groups, etc., then it's worth spending the money, getting the project to spend the money on an upgrade because this is work related. Make sure your Zoom is updated. If you use Zoom, that's what we use. They always have new versions coming up. Make sure you have the latest version. And for more tips on hardware, there was this article that I saw in the New York Times, 5 simple ways to improve your Wi-Fi. I recommend you read that, and you can always, Google how to improve your Wi-Fi, and you'll have a lot to look at. But it's important to have the proper equipment in place. For myself, my own experience, we went from doing things face-to-face to moving to things online and never really thought about my router until later on in the process. So things we learned along the way. All right, so day of the interview. Before I continue, are there any questions on what I have covered so far?
One of the first things you said was you had this ad that says, "Does your brother date men?" And it had
Yes.
a picture of apparently a sister was hugging the brother, I guess.
Yes.
I just wondered, it seems like that would then end up attracting sisters more so than brothers, and is that what you end up getting in your study, or?
That was something that we considered, that we might get more sisters than brothers. What we have found, and this is still new, we still have to confirm with it. We have to go back and look at the data. What we have found is that older sisters have more of the finger wagging authority and power over younger siblings. So it kind of worked out that way. But no, we did not intend to recruit only sisters. And so far we've had about it's still been roughly 50-50 brothers and sisters that Latino gay men have brought to the study.
Okay, and you talked about Grindr. It seems like the IRB sometimes, at least to me, oversteps their bounds. You couldn't like push back on, like somehow you were gonna increase the problem with COVID by observing people. I mean, you just had to give in, right?
At first, yes. At first we gave in. So we gave in March when all this was starting. And to be honest, you know, even I had no idea. That seemed like, yeah, that makes sense. No one should be on Grindr. And it wasn't until about a month into this where, you know, there were reports and people talking about the fact that, you know, men were using Grindr. They were using hookup apps as a way to socialize. So then I went back to the IRB and told them, look, we want to go back to recruiting on Grindr and other forms of social media. And, you know, here are some reports showing, you know, backing up our reasons, you know, for doing so. So you could push back with the IRB. I do think sometimes they overstep. But lucky for us, we were able to kind of push back fairly quickly.
Great.
All right. So.
A quick question.
Yes.
Yes, so you briefly talked about providing the actual interview questions in advance, right?
Yes.
Has there been any adverse effects out of it? Because I think it really depends on what kind of questions are asked. But if they have enough time to prepare for their answers, especially in purely qualitative research, doesn't it raise an issue of like not just they're providing you with not just their own answers, but other people's answers? And then we really cannot like expect like the spontaneity of the respondents sharing opinions with you. And sometimes the silent moment after you ask the question and that nonverbal cue sometimes has some meaning in terms of either their hesitance or their discomfort with the question or things like that. But by providing those questions like word to word in advance of time, I'm wondering if there is any kind of negative as well.
Okay, that's a fair point. Just to be clear, we didn't provide all the questions ahead of time. I just provided the first 3 questions, what I think of as usually kind of the opening questions to warm people up. So I thought that it was okay to send those questions ahead of time first. I did not send I didn't send the entire interview guide to them.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for clarification.
Yeah, again, this is just to help participants feel a little more comfortable, and not all of them, for sure. Okay, so the day of the interview. So before you start, there's some things that I would do. I would check the surveys for errors. Since the surveys were completed ahead of time, I could look at these surveys before the interview even started. So for example, we would ask participants, how many friends do you have? How many of them are men? How many of them are women? And I had one participant put, you know, I have 10 friends, 7 men, 5 women. You know, the math didn't add up. So we can go back and fix some of these things. Or they might say that they don't have any brothers or sisters, that they don't have any sisters, they only have brothers, but then in the interview it would come out that they did have sisters, right? Because maybe they misunderstood something and put a 0. So then we can also ask them in the interview, during the interview, for any corrections. Actually, before the interview starts, we can ask them for any corrections of the survey. The advantages, I thought, of having them complete the survey ahead of time is that we can incorporate some of the survey questions into the interview if it's feasible for your project. So we ask questions about sexual behavior and sexual risk. So I knew ahead of time before the interview, you know, how many sex partners this person has had in the last 3 months, how many times they had condomless sex, how many times they used drugs when they had sex, and when was the last time they had sex with a man. Within, yesterday, within the week, within the month, in the last 3 months. So I had all this information on them already. So I could use that to kind of have a sense of, to kind of navigate the answers they would give me during the conversations, right? So if it's feasible for your project, then you can use the survey questions, their answers in your questioning for how you think about the person that you're interviewing. And here I have explained the project #fail. This is a big #fail. So, for many participants, this is their first time being in a study. So it doesn't matter that our recruiter explained what the study was, the coordinator who set up the interview appointment explained to them what the study was. By the time they come to me, they still don't know what the study really is. So somewhere in the middle of the interview, something will come up about, so what's going to happen with this interview, or what are you going to do with these data or my answers? And I will start explaining to them that I'm going, this is a 5-year project. This is just the first phase. We're going to analyze these, develop messages, pilot test them, randomized control trial, blah, 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 blah. Then I will get my transcripts back with a huge chunk of the transcript being me talking about the project and still getting charged by line, right, for having these things transcribed. So #fail. So the day of the interview, right before I start recording, I ask participants if they have any questions about the project. Again, I'll just tell them more about it anyway, just a quick, like 25 words or less spiel about the project, because I found that it didn't matter how many times the team members told them what the project was, the day of they still don't know. And I found myself doing it during the interview and paying for it, literally. I always let participants know when I'm about to start recording. So when they come on and start talking, we would, answer questions, explain to them what the project was, and tell them now we're about to start the interview, and I'm going to start recording, and then I will hit the record button. So there's no surprises. Lock the meeting. I think we all may have read stories or heard of horror stories of people who would have their Zoom meetings crashed by people who have nothing better to do with their time. So lock your meetings. I think this is really important. And consent your participants. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the consent process now that we're actually at that stage. So we have to prepare the participants. How do you prepare participants for the actual interview, right? Besides giving them all this information before you start recording them. So I would always tell participants that this is going to be a conversation, not an interview. Although we have to say this is an interview, it's a research study, blah, blah, blah. I would always tell participants, this is more of a conversation. And we're just gonna have a conversation about PrEP, about sexual health, about your siblings, about your family. You can ask any questions. And so I would try to make it very casual. I would let participants know that follow-up questions are not a challenge. And again, this depends on the kind of study that you have, but we're dealing with substance use and sexual risk behaviors. So it would be very easy for participants to take things too personally, depending on how the questions are asked. So to put them at ease, right from the very beginning, I would tell them, I'm going to ask you some questions, and then I'm going to ask you some follow-up questions. So for example, I would say to them, if you tell me that you like to smoke crack every Saturday night and have condomless sex with like 6 different men, I'm going to say to you, all right, that's interesting. Tell me more. If on the other hand, you tell me, I think gay men should never have sex until they get married because gay sex is a sin, I'm going to say to you, well, that's very interesting. Tell me more about how you reached that conclusion. So I would kind of model for them a poker face, and I don't care which extreme you're giving me, it doesn't matter. I'm going to ask you the same question. Tell me more about that. Help me understand how you reached that conclusion. How did you reach that view? So again, I would tell them this before we started recording, so they knew what to expect. I would tell participants that I would be taking notes. So for example, I would literally show them these notes and tell them I'm going to be taking notes. and just flashed in some of the notes that I had taken beforehand from the survey. Why? Because when I would take notes, sometimes I would look away or look down. And I noticed they might think that I'm not paying attention or that I'm looking at my cell phone or something like that. So I would let them know I am taking notes and literally just show them the notes. You know, I am taking notes. And most of them would say, oh, it's okay, no problem, no worries, which is easy for them to say once they know what you're doing, right? But in the middle of, I think it would be a lot harder. Also, if appropriate, tell your participants that you will be deleting the Zoom meeting. This is what we did. We're talking about sexual risks, substance use, and as much as we tell participants that, you know, that they're anonymous, you know, they don't want their faces attached to what they're saying, right? And we just found that reminding participants that we are keeping the audio will be transcribed, and eventually when the study is over, all of that will be destroyed, starting with the video even much sooner, because we really don't care about the video. That also helped to put some of the participants at ease. Another way that I found was helpful to prepare participants was to tell them that it's okay to curse, and then I would model that behavior. So I would curse, use slang, especially around sexual behaviors and sexual risk, and just talk to the participant and tell them, you know, how would you say this to your friends? How would you talk to your friends about getting laid, etc. And just, I would say it. Because it's one thing for me to say, I don't care if you curse. It's another thing for me to actually just use the curse word, right? So they're gonna hear it and just kind of break that ice. Like, I really don't care what language you use. And then laugh about it or just make a joke. Again, this is all ways to prepare our participants. I would explain to participants also why we wanted them to use a pseudonym, explain to them that we're just interested in their data. You know, we want to be able to divorce the data and the findings from who they are personally. And I will tell them that we need them to use a fake name. Not everyone was familiar with the term pseudonym, so I would just say fake name, and everyone understands that. But it's important for them to explain to them why. Even if they understand on some level why, I think it's good for them to hear from us to reinforce the fact that we really want to protect their privacy. I would meet participants who would say, I don't care if people know, you know, how many men I have sex with, or, you know, if I smoke meth, I don't care. And I would say, that's great, that's fine. If people find out that you smoke meth, they can do so through you, but they cannot do so through us. Not through any presentation that we do, any paper that we publish. There's no way that people should be able to connect what we write with who you are. So that's on you if you don't care. As far as we're concerned, we're going to do our best to prevent anything like that from happening. And then you let participants know, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that you're actually going to start recording right now. And I mentioned, you know, lock the meeting and consent the participants. So I would tell the participants ahead of time, right before I started recording, I would tell them, I'm going to start recording. The first two things I'm going to ask you are, number one, do you agree to voluntarily be a part of the study and to be recorded? And you have to answer yes, because if you answer no, we cannot continue the interview. And then I'm going to ask you, if you qualify for any future studies of ours, can we contact you again? And you can say yes or no, that won't affect this interview. So going back to the point of consent, right? We have a waiver of written consent. We would nevertheless email participants a consent form, and we would have them respond that they agreed to be a part of the study. And now we're getting them on record saying that they consent to be a part of the study, that they consent to be recorded. And then in my notes, I would do so as well. I know our IRB was very particular about consent. So, you know, we have 3 different ways of tracking the fact that they agreed to be a part of the study. So I just told them ahead of time, I'm going to ask you about consent. I need you to say yes. And then after I went through those 2 formal questions, I would just say, great. So how are you? How's it going? And just start the interview from that point of view. And I also think it's really important to prepare ourselves. You know, prepare yourself for the interview. So your body language, you know, about 90% of communication is body language. I think that still holds true even through video. So if you go from being hunched over and having an interview like this with people versus a little more relaxed, more open, right? So be very mindful of your body language when you are interviewing people, because it still comes through, even if they cannot see all of you. And smile, smile, smile. We put people at ease when we smile, and I think it's very important during interviews, at least the way I conducted the interviews, to smile. Smile when I met them, smile when I introduced myself, smile as I ask the questions, right? You just keep smiling, and it really does make a difference to participants. Especially if you have participants who are more on the grumpy side or not so friendly side, right? It just kind of gives them space to see that, you know, you're the happy one in the group, if you will. And if you have participants who are very friendly, it just, you know, accelerates being able to establish some rapport with folks. Any questions for during the interview?
Yeah, I have a question about IRB approval and recording the video. And I was wondering how your IRB took that, and if you told them how long you were going to keep the video recording.
So we did tell the IRB that we were using Zoom. Let me think carefully how precise we were about the recording, the video. If I remember correctly, they jumped on the video issue first. So we were very explicit that we would get rid of the video after everything was transcribed and approved. So I never promised that we're going to record that. Sorry, I never promised that we're going to delete the video as soon as the interview is over.
Okay.
Right. I just said we're going to delete the video, you know, once everything is transcribed and everything is checked. So I purposefully left it a little vague, you know, to give ourselves wiggle room if we need to go back.
Okay.
But you do need to let the IRB know how long you plan to hold on to these recordings and what you're going to do with them.
Yeah, I mean, a video is much more identifiable than a audio recording of voice. So I was curious. I hadn't considered even asking for consent of recording the video. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Anyone else?
Oh, and I just, for clarification purposes, are these group discussions or are these one-on-one?
These are dyads, so I'm interviewing sibling pairs.
Okay, okay.
I'm interviewing sibling pairs. So it's 3 of us. At most, we've had 4 people at one point. Sometimes other team members would be on the interviews, but they would know ahead of time.
Okay.
Who all is going to be in the interview. Oh, and the one thing I forgot to mention as well, the day of the interview, depending on, you know, this depends on you and the population you're working with, but, you know, I asked not to be introduced to people as like Dr. Del Pino. You know, Dr. Del Pino is going to interview you, you know, I recruited you or I set your appointment and Dr. Del Pino is going to interview you. Didn't do any of that. Just Homero was fine. Going by my first name is fine by me. So when I did interview folks, I didn't realize that I was faculty. A lot of folks, I would say, didn't realize that I was faculty or anything like that. I would just talk about the research project and just jump into the questions. So I think that also helps put people at ease. It could help put some people at ease.
All right, okay.
All right. When we're done with the interview, now what? You know, you can just ask people how they feel about it and what would have been different. So I literally asked people, how do you think your answers would have been different had we had this conversation face to face? Okay. And then you'll get some insight as to what worked for them or what didn't work for them. And I'll show you some of the responses in the next slide. I always like to ask people in my interviews, what should I have asked? So I tell the participants, you know, all the questions I've asked you are from the point of view of researchers. What the research team thinks is important. But at the end of the day, you're the expert when it comes to your sexual health. You're the expert when it comes to thinking about PrEP and what it means to have sibling relationships, supportive ones and maybe ones that aren't supportive. So what do you think I should have asked you? Is there something that I missed? So one or two things would happen. Either A, they would suggest questions that you should ask. And if they did, then I would ask them that question because they suggested it. Or the other thing that could happen is they would go back and revisit something that we already talked about and expand on it a little more, which I think is always helpful to just let people, because at this point they feel like the interview is over, the questions are over, a little more relaxed, and then they'll just talk more freely. So I have found this to be helpful. In the spirit of maintaining rapport and respect for participants, I would let them know, I would summarize my impressions and maybe some of my key findings. I would focus particularly on the positives, right? So I would say things like, it's really great to see, your sibling bond. It's nice to see how much your sister supports you, or it's nice to see that your brother goes out clubbing with you to gay clubs, even though he's straight. I just think it's wonderful how this is very supportive. I like how you are proof that there's more than just homophobia in our communities, et cetera, et cetera. So always end on a positive. And then I would also let them know we are now done recording. This is especially useful because, again, trial and error, lessons learned. I found myself in the beginning recording the whole interaction of paying them. Oh, what's your Venmo handle? What's this? What's that? And we just kind of went this back and forth, and it was recorded, transcribed, and paid for. So be more mindful of when you stop the recording, and I also let them know when I stop the recording. And then when you pay the participants, have them request payment from you if possible. So in one instance, someone said to me, I said to them, what's your handle name? They said, Juan Sanchez. So I looked up Juan Sanchez and I was about to hit send, and just something in me was like, just double check. And I asked them, this is you, right, Juan Sanchez? And they're like, no, I'm Juan Sanchez 172, right? There was another one, right? So almost sent it to the wrong person. So I thought it's easier. Well, it's not easier, but it's definitely safer if you have them ask you for money. We tried doing the scanning bar and we totally forgot to do that. It didn't work for us on the screen. So if they can request it, that's even better. I also suggest setting Venmo to private mode. This is something that the IRB did point out to me and didn't occur to me because I didn't use Venmo that often. Set the status to private. For those of you who do have Venmo, you may know that you can go on Venmo and you see almost like a timeline of people paying, paying Maria for, $30 for the margaritas last week, paying my brother $50 for dinner, and people just have a whole timeline, all these posts about who they're paying for what reasons. But you can set it to private mode so no one knows that there's ever been a financial transaction between you and the participants. So this is an important way to also protect participant privacy. So I mentioned earlier that, we're gonna rethink why do we conduct qualitative research in the first place, right? And kind of keep our eyes on the prize. So I just wanna go over what I think of what are some of the pros of conducting online research, online interviews. So some of the things that we learned was we get to expand our recruitment area. We ended up interviewing sibling pairs from the Bay Area. We recruited sibling pairs that were not living together, but were in different states, East Coast, West Coast. We even interviewed sibling pairs where one was in the US and the other was in Mexico. So just to go back pre-COVID-19 mindset, when I first conceptualized the study, all I could think was, how do we get people into our offices, or how do I go to them? Which for all intents and purposes limits us to LA County, Southern California if we're very ambitious, right, to drive around and interview people. The advantages of doing this on Zoom was we got to interview much more people that were living much farther away. And also it made it, and this brings me to our next point, no traveling. So not all the siblings lived together. Sometimes they lived apart. It would have been a logistical nightmare to get people to drive from different parts of LA County. 3 different people from LA County to drive and meet somewhere for an interview, right? Given all the different work schedules and given what rush hour is here in Los Angeles. So no traveling was a good thing, especially in LA when people are working. If they have to travel after work to come be interviewed, that's a lot to ask for people to go through rush hour to come and be interviewed. So that made a huge difference. And because there was no travel, we were able to actually interview people right after work, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, our latest interviews were at 8 o'clock at night, right? Because there was no traveling. They could go to work, they could come home from work, have their dinner, relax, and then move on to the interview without having to jump back into cars and drive somewhere to be interviewed, right? So this is definitely an advantage. No bathing. And this is something a participant said to me when I asked him, what do you like about being interviewed on Zoom? And he said, I like the fact that I didn't have to bathe this morning. I just rolled out of bed and jumped online. I didn't have to bathe. So I found it amusing, so I figured I would share that with you all. So no bathing can be an advantage to conducting these interviews online. Participants did talk about being more comfortable at home. So they said, I'm in my bedroom right now. They had a kind of fake background on, so I didn't know that. They say, I'm in my bedroom right now, laying in my bed. I'm very comfortable. So I'm comfortable. I can answer all these questions more comfortably. So they found it to be more of an advantage to actually not have to come into the office and see me. Going on Zoom, it's also more comfortable where you can conduct these interviews, more flexible in terms of locations. So we conducted interviews in people's homes. I think that's obvious. In a supply closet, we interviewed someone who ended up having to work later than he expected. So he ended up going to a supply closet, not a tiny one. This was big. This is big, spacious area where it had all these supplies. And he went in there, he had privacy, and we had the interview from a supply closet. I've interviewed people in their cars. I've interviewed folks where, one brother's in the car, the other brother was home. My last sibling pair interview, both siblings were in the car. And here you do have to be careful. I interviewed someone from IK, and she was driving. She called me while she was driving, so I told her I needed her to pull over and park so we can do the interview. She said, no, I can do this right now. She was very adamant about it. And I said, then let's just reschedule. Again, trying to be very accommodating. I said, you're doing me a favor by giving me your time and your personal information. So I'm happy to work around your schedule. And she insisted, like, no, I can just do this while I'm driving. And I said to her, no. Then I put my foot down. I said, no, if you don't pull over, we'll just reschedule. And so she ended up pulling over. So again, just something to be mindful of. And I also interviewed someone who was at a park. He was walking around the park while I was interviewing him. That I don't recommend. When he was interviewed, he was home. When he did the dry run, he was home. The day he was interviewed, he was not. He chose to do something else. So all we can do is, expect the unexpected, but this is, still we have flexibility with Zoom to go anywhere with the participants. And one of the participants also said to me, Zoom is the new normal, right? We spoke to participants and I asked them about what it was like to have these interviews on Zoom, and they said, we use Zoom for work all the time. We Zoom with our families. We have like e-drinking meetings, e-meetups all the time. Everything is Zoom now. So Zoom is the new normal. So it may not be as challenging for some participants as we anticipate. And also, Zoom may not be as challenging now as it was when the pandemic first started. A lot of people have transitioned to work on Zoom or to socializing on Zoom. So by the time they participate in an interview, being on Zoom is not new anymore. It's old hat. So again, timing, I think, is also really important here. But again, it's an advantage to be on Zoom. So what are some of the things that participants said? Feels like we're anonymous. And this was Andrea. She just felt like, even though we can see each other, the fact that she was home, we're behind a computer screen, she just felt that it was anonymous. Jane has shared with us that she would feel more nervous in person. Like if we were actually face to face and I could see her and how she's fidgeting or not, that she would feel even more nervous. Someone said you were smiling a lot. So I made it a point to smile during interviews. Some folks actually noticed. That was their feedback, which is why I make it a recommendation now. Smile a lot in your interviews. A sibling pair reported that they were less nervous doing this online. Other folks said that they're used to speaking honestly, like in AA meetings, right? So for some people, the venue does not matter. And this is what I like about these participants in particular. They're both in recovery. and they talk about being in AA and always being open. So it didn't matter to them whether they were in person or online, they were going to be open. They were determined to do that. And of course, which means that for some people, as Alexis and Viviana pointed out, it doesn't make a difference. They really don't care if it's Zoom or in person. Now, it's not all peachy, right? There are some cons to online interviews as well. So there is a loss of body language, of being able to read some people's body language online. And that could make it harder to establish rapport or for people to get a sense of who you are or what you're doing. I do think it's a little harder to establish rapport sometimes online, depending on who the participant is. I think it's just, there will always be a class of people for whom being in person would just be easier, you know, and that's just inescapable. But one of the areas in particular where it's challenging, I think, is humor and jokes. Humor and jokes are harder to land, and quips aren't always captured by audio. So in person, I'm a little more relaxed than when I'm doing presentations. So it's easier to engage people. It was easier to engage participants. If someone said something, you can always say something smart or silly. And we just kind of have this camaraderie established with participants. That's harder to do on Zoom, especially when we have the sibling pairs in different locations, because the microphone only picks up one person speaking at a time. And part of what humor is, or especially making, you know, a quip, is you kind of speak over each other in some ways, right? Or you kind of finish someone's sentence, and that doesn't translate well because you just didn't hear the person, right? It just comes across as an interruption. So for me, I found that to be somewhat limiting. And we also need to keep in mind generational considerations. So most of the people whose quotes I showed you in the previous slide are people in their late 20s and early 30s. So they were okay with Zoom. But we did interview someone's mom. She was in her 80s. And that did not go as easy as we expected to go. So the mom sat down in front of the camera, kind of the way I am right now. And then we started talking to her and she couldn't hear us. Then we realized her son had put in AirPods into her ears, but forgot to turn them on. So he had to come back and put on the AirPods and turn them on. He walked out of the room. We tried talking to her and she still really couldn't hear us. The volume wasn't high enough. So he had to come back into the room, adjust the AirPods. He left. We started talking. Then she couldn't hear us again. And it wasn't the AirPods, it was the computer itself. So it was just a lot of back and forth. We had interviewed him first. This is for my case, so we interviewed people separately. We interviewed him first on the computer, things were fine. Brought his mom on. I guess she had some hearing loss, so that's why he put in the AirPods, but that just became more of a mess. So we do need to consider generational differences in our participants, not just in terms of facility with using technology, but also in terms of physical capacities. Like where are they at physically to be able to do this interview online? All right, so my objectives for this talk today was to give you some pointers and tips to prepare for an online interview and hopefully convince you that there are at least 3 advantages to conducting interviews online. So thank you for your time. Thank you for those who kept the video on so I can feel like I'm talking to a person. And I'm now happy to take any questions, comments. And the advantage of being the screen, I am shielded from people throwing tomatoes and eggs.
Thank you. This was really informative, and I did learn to appreciate some of the advantages that I don't think I've thought of before. But some of my particular specific considerations and concerns I have are for group discussions, focusing on very sensitive personal experiences, and what to do with the video feature. Again, if these are, and I've tried to keep the group small, like 4 to 5 people, but if they don't know each other and it is a very sensitive personal experience, and if some choose to not use the video feature, how to build that rapport so we can actually have a conversation. Given the pandemic, I've changed the design to allow for one-on-one interviews if they'd be more comfortable doing that. But I was wondering if you had any tips. And again, the generational considerations, all of the participants would be, you know, considered older adults.
I don't know, to be honest with you. What I would think, if we were to think this through, and we can definitely talk more about this offline, I would toy with the idea of just having maybe everyone without their video, right? It depends. When you did your groups, did more people have their videos on or off? If most people had their videos off, I think of older generation might be more comfortable just picking up the phone and calling people, and that's just easier. And that translates to no video, right? That might be the case. If you're able to know ahead of time, perhaps ask them ahead of time how they feel about being on video. Then you can get a sense also of what to anticipate during the group. And this is where I think this is probably a little harsher. You might be also more heavy-handed, right? You might say, look, a requirement for participating is that you put on your video. And you let people know ahead of time. If you have people clamoring to be in the study and you can afford to lose people who are interested, I might do something like that. And it just makes it easier from the standpoint of data collection. Everyone's on video. No one has to worry that I'm spilling my guts out. And meanwhile, there's just names on the screen, right? So I think that's another way to do it. I think it's up to you. But those are my suggestions, my immediate suggestions. But I'm happy to think through this more with you. I know your project, so I'm happy to talk about that. Any other questions? I see Art's mouth moving. I don't know, but you're on mute.
I'm trying to. Thank you. Sorry about that. I was just going to see if we could share a QR code so that people could do a quick evaluation for the talk.
Oh, yes, I forgot to put that on. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I have it too, or however you like.
Stop sharing.
You can put it up. This is what everybody's doing nowadays. So.
Right. So any questions or comments or,
sure.
I see stuff in the chat.
Okay.
Thanks for your presentation, Homero. I had a question about having multiple participants when they're in different locations. Did you have technical problems getting people on at the same time? I mean, it sounds like the age group, it wasn't as much of an issue, but in terms of like the flow of the conversation and started.
There were no technical problems per se because we had one of our team members who would pre-test Zoom with both of them individually. Mm-hmm. So the biggest challenge, we did have one technical problem once, like they did the pre-test with our team member in one room, but the day of the interview, they moved to the other side of the house. And so then that was a mess. That it does happen, that was a mess. They kept getting disconnected and then coming back on and switching from their router to their cellular data. And yeah, that was challenging. That happened then. The biggest challenge with multiple people has been getting people there on time. And again, that also hasn't been too bad. I would say 10 minutes, almost 15 minutes was the latest that someone had come on late. And by then, one of the siblings was feeling embarrassed, like, I don't know where my brother is, I don't know where my sister is. And we'll start texting and calling. And we just sit there, smile, and tell them that it's fine. Because I really do believe that, they're sharing their time with us, right? So I can wait. Like, I'm here for this, so.
I think the thing that I find most challenging about calls with more than 2 people is the turn taking, that you can't see who you're making eye contact with, who's looking at you. And so I'd be very surprised if you had a meeting where everyone had their cameras off, if that would be very successful because of that. Because you can't see who's getting ready to talk.
That's a good point. I guess what I was thinking was, and again, I don't know, so I will preface this again, which I don't know. The only reason I suggested cameras off was I was remembering back before videos where we would have these gigantic phone conferences, right? And I don't know how many people were on a phone call at once. Here, people might have a sense because at least you see names, but you're right. I think there is something that would be lost if there was no eye contact with anyone. To be honest with you, even doing this presentation, right, it made a difference to have at least one person on video so I could feel like I'm talking to someone. No, but you're right. So this is trial and error and lessons learned. This is what we've figured out so far. And I'm sure you all will figure out even better things or better ways of doing things as you go on through your projects. Any other questions? I saw in the chat someone said, will slides be available? I think they can be made available. There shouldn't be a problem.
Yes, yes, absolutely. We'll post the slides on the RCMAR CHIME website.
That was a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. I also want to point out that actually someone from our team, from a research team, also logged in at one point. I can't see if he's still on.
Yeah, I'm still on.
Yeah, thank you. So Edwin can also help answer some of these questions. He was also part of the team and participated in some of the interviews.
They were just checking in to make sure you weren't making stuff up. I'm just kidding.
Right? Make sure I'm not making stuff up or taking all the credit for a team effort.
That was great. That was very informative, very useful, very engaging, and very timely. So thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, especially our RCMAR scholars, I'm accessible to you anytime. So just let me know.
Thank you so much, Homero.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank
Great
you.
job, Homero.
Yeah, it was really helpful.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a good evening.
Have a good one.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Nice to see you again.
Okay. Nice to see everyone.